Hello, my name is Annalie Pettis, and today I will be presenting my final project presentation. I'm going to be reading off some notes that I made for myself on my computer right here. So to get started, let's talk about my introduction to the work. For my ethics project, I chose the West Wing episode, Two Cathedrals. This episode centers on President Jed Bartlet, specifically after the death of Miss Landingham, who was not only his secretary, but someone he had a very close personal relationship, as she also worked for his father, who he has a complicated relationship with. What makes this episode very valuable from an ethics perspective is that Bartlet is experiencing an intense personal crisis while simultaneously holding one of the most powerful positions in the world, the President of the United States. He's grieving, he's angry at God, he's questioning his beliefs, and facing major and political leadership decisions like running for re-election. So rather than looking at whether Bartlet is a good or a bad person, I wanted to value him as a moral actor operating within a complicated public institution. The question I ultimately would ask when looking at this episode as a whole: would I trust someone like Bartlet to lead a public organization? The central ethical dilemma is the conflict between Bartlet's personal identity and his public responsibility. After Mrs. Landingham's death, Bartlet's grief becomes intertwined with his faith. In the cathedral, as we see in the episode, he essentially confronts God about the suffering that he's experienced post Miss Landingham's death. The scene is extremely important to the episode because it shows that his decisions aren't being made by a completely detached political leader. His emotions, beliefs, relationships, and experiences all influence how he understands his responsibility as president. This creates a second dilemma. Should a public leader be expected to separate personal emotions from professional decisions? I don't think the answer is completely yes in its entirety. Public servants are human beings at the same time, and empathy and personal values can actually make someone a better leader. But there is a point where personal emotions can interfere with public interest. That's where Bartlet becomes ethically complicated. His grief is understandable, but his position means that he has an obligation to prevent his personal crisis from becoming an institutional crisis. There's also a conflict between power and accountability. Bartlet has enormous authority as the President of the United States, but having authority does not mean that every decision he makes is automatically ethical. His power actually increases his obligation to listen to others, consider consequences, and remain accountable. So now, let's talk about stakeholders. The most obvious stakeholder is Bartlet himself, because these events directly affect his emotional and moral decision-making. Ultimately, he's the one making the decision, and he's a very intellectual human being, and he knows that this decision could impact, hurt, affect so many people. But the consequences extend much further. His senior staff are affected because they have to manage the presidency while also supporting their leader. The American public is arguably the most important stakeholder because presidential decisions can affect millions of people who have no direct voice in the White House. His family, political opponents, and the broader institution of the presidency are also stakeholders. But one of the most important ethical issues here is the difference between formal power and moral influence. Bartlet has the formal authority to make decisions, but his staff have an important informal responsibility to challenge him when necessary. When he comes to them with ideas, it's their responsibility to challenge them. They can't tell the president exactly what he wants to hear every time just because he's president. That's not their job. That matters in public administration because ethical organizations need systems where people can disagree with leadership without being treated as disloyal or disrespectful. In other words, ethical loyalty is not the same thing as blind loyalty. Now, let's apply some of the course concepts that we've learned this summer. The first one I would apply is virtue ethics. Virtue ethics ask what kind of a person a leader is and what character traits influence their decisions. Bartlet demonstrates virtues that are important in public service: intelligence, empathy, courage, loyalty, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. Or instead of overwhelming, we could call it a strong sense of responsibility. However, virtue ethics also help reveal his weaknesses. Bartlet's pride and anger can interfere with his judgment. This is important because ethical leadership isn't simply about processing good qualities. It's about developing partial judgment and practical judgment to know when those qualities should guide a decision and then when they can become harmful. The second concept I'd like to talk about is practical wisdom. Bartlet is constantly required to balance competing values rather than follow one simple rule. He has to balance personal grief with public responsibility, loyalty with accountability, and his own belief with obligations within the presidency. Practical wisdom basically means that recognizing an ethical decision can often require judgment about the circumstances rather than simply applying a universal rule. Bartlett's challenge is not figuring out what is technically allowed. His challenge is determining what a responsible leader should do given the circumstances. The third concept, obviously, is public trust. As a president, a public official, they have a special responsibility because citizens give government leaders authority with the expectation that they will use it for the public's good and the public's benefit. Bartlett's personal struggles therefore become ethically relevant when they have the potential to influence public decisions. This doesn't mean that leaders have to be emotionless. In fact, empathy can strengthen public trust if they see that in a public leader. But they do have to demonstrate that their personal interests and emotions will not consistently override their responsibility that they have to the public. I would also connect the episode to accountability. Bartlett has to ultimately recognize that being president means accepting responsibility for both his decisions and their consequences. Accountability prevents leadership from becoming simply about power. It forces a leader to ask themselves, can I justify this decision if I were sitting face to face with someone that I serve, like a constituent? I would describe Bartlett as ethically strong, but ethically imperfect. His biggest ethical weaknesses are his pride, emotional intensity, and difficulty separating his personal beliefs from his public role. Those weaknesses create legitimate concerns about whether he can exercise good judgment under pressure. However, I don't think his emotional struggle makes him unethical as a president. In some ways, his willingness to confront his anger and question himself demonstrate moral self-awareness, as we see specifically very strongly in this episode. The people around him also play an important role. His staff demonstrate that good organizational ethics require people who are willing to provide honest advice rather than simply protect the leader's ego. And if you watch The West Wing, you can see that his staff are not afraid to do that. This is where organizational ethics becomes extremely important. An ethical organization isn't created by having one ethical leader. It requires a culture where people can question decisions, communicate concerns, and hold leadership accountable. The episode also demonstrates how institutional pressure, loyalty, and fear and ambition can shape ethical behavior. Everyone surrounding the president has incentives to protect the administration because they want to run for re-election and serve 2 terms, but they also have responsibilities to the institution and to the public. This creates tension between what's the best for the president and what's the best for the public. For a public administrator, that distinction is very important. Now, let's wrap things up. The biggest lesson that I take from 2 Cathedrals is that ethical leadership is not about being perfect. It's about how you respond when your values, emotions, and responsibilities become a factor in conflict. Bartlett shows that personal values can be a source of strength for public leaders, but they can also become a blind spot if leaders are not willing to question themselves. I also think that the episode demonstrates why accountability and constructive dissent are necessary in public organizations. A leader needs people around them who are willing to say, I disagree, and without that disagreement automatically being interpreted as disloyalty. For future public servants, I think that the lesson is to develop both strong values and the humility to recognize when those values or emotions may be influencing your judgment. And if I were to evaluate Bartlett for a real public leadership position, my final verdict would be trust him, but with caution. I would trust him because he demonstrates empathy, courage, intelligence, integrity, and a genuine commitment to public service. But I would also recognize that his pride and his emotional reactions can create risks. Ultimately, I think that President Bartlett represents a realistic version of ethical leadership. He isn't ethical because he always makes the perfect decision, but he's compelling because he struggles with the same moral conflicts that other people do. Those conflicts have much larger consequences because of the power he holds, though. And that's what I think makes The West Wing so important to public administration. Public leadership is ultimately about making difficult decisions while remembering that the authority you have is not yours for its own sakes, but it's entrusted for you to serve others. Thank you.